September 6, 1976, 1:11 p.m. Hakodate Airport, northern Japan. The air traffic controller at Hakodate's civilian airport reached for his headset with hands that had begun to tremble. Through the tower window, the Sea of Japan stretched gray and calm under low clouds, temperature hovering at 19 degrees Celsius. Commercial traffic was light this Monday afternoon, a domestic flight to Sapporo scheduled for departure in 20 minutes, nothing unusual. Then the radio crackled with Russian-accented English, barely comprehensible through static and urgency. Hakodate Tower. This is Soviet aircraft. Request emergency landing. The controller's tea went cold in his hand. Soviet aircraft didn't request anything from Japanese civilian airports. They certainly didn't speak English on international frequencies. Through the afternoon haze, he spotted it. A silver shape descending fast from the northwest. Too fast. Wings swept back in a configuration he'd never seen on any commercial jet. The shape grew larger, the scream of its engines now audible even through the tower's thick windows. Other controllers clustered behind him. Someone whispered a profanity. The aircraft was enormous, angular, menacing in a way that transcended mere machinery. It looked like a weapon. "All aircraft clear the runway immediately," the senior controller barked into his microphone. "We have an emergency inbound." The Sapporo flight, already taxiing, reversed course toward the terminal. Ground crew scattered. The silver aircraft dropped lower, gear deploying with visible hydraulic vapor. Its nose was painted a flat, radar-absorbent black. Twin vertical stabilizers towered above the fuselage. As it passed overhead at 200 meters, the tower windows vibrated from the engine wash. The landing gear struck concrete hard, once, twice, black smoke pluming from overheated tires. The aircraft's drag chute deployed, a massive orange and white canopy that snapped taut behind the tail. It rolled for what seemed an impossible distance, finally stopping just 100 meters from the runway's end, nose pointed at the perimeter fence and the civilian terminal beyond. Silence settled over the airport. Then the canopy opened, hinging forward, and a figure in an orange pressure suit climbed down the side of the fuselage using built-in handholds. He pulled off his helmet, dropped it on the tarmac, and raised both hands above his head. His face was pale, expressionless, sweat-streaked. He was 29 years old. His name was Viktor Ivanovich Belenko, and he had just delivered to the West the most closely guarded secret in Soviet military aviation, the MiG-25 Foxbat, the fastest interceptor ever built, the aircraft NATO had feared for a decade. The aircraft the Americans would pay $100,000 to possess. The aircraft that would, in the cold fluorescent light of a hangar in central Japan, reveal that Soviet technology was not 10 years ahead of the West, but 10 years behind. For 9 years, the MiG-25 had been a ghost haunting NATO intelligence analyses. Its existence was first confirmed in 1967 when a reconnaissance satellite photographed something unexpected at Zhukovsky Air Base outside Moscow. An interceptor with a profile unlike anything Western engineers thought possible. By 1971, the CIA had designated it Foxbat and assigned it to the highest tier of intelligence priority. Estimates of its capabilities varied wildly, but all agreed on one thing. It was revolutionary. The official Soviet story, promoted through carefully leaked specifications and public displays, portrayed the MiG-25 as a technological masterpiece. It could fly at Mach 3.2, over 2,000 miles per hour. It could reach altitudes of 90,000 feet, well above the ceiling of any Western fighter. Its radar could track targets at ranges exceeding 100 kilometers. At the 1971 Paris Air Show, the Soviets allowed a MiG-25 to perform a low-altitude pass, its engines shaking windows across Le Bourget Airport. Pilots described a sound like fabric tearing across the sky. NATO officers stood on the tarmac, squinting against the engine glare, knowing they were watching something their own air forces couldn't match. Western intelligence services believed the Foxbat represented a quantum leap in Soviet engineering. Titanium construction, they assumed, given the thermal stresses of Mach 3 flight. Advanced turbofan engines with variable geometry inlets. Fly-by-wire flight controls. Lightweight composite materials. Pulse Doppler radar with look-down, shoot-down capability against low-flying bombers. The U.S. Air Force had responded to the perceived threat by accelerating development of the F-15 Eagle, an air superiority fighter designed specifically to counter the Foxbat's advantages. Hundreds of millions of dollars flowed into titanium manufacturing research, advanced avionics, and engines that could sustain supersonic cruise without afterburner. At stake was the entire strategic calculus of nuclear deterrence. American bomber crews flying B-52s and the new B-1 prototype needed to believe they could penetrate Soviet airspace if World War III ever came. If the Foxbat could truly intercept them at any altitude and any speed, the bomber leg of the nuclear triad became obsolete. The Soviet Union, already fielding thousands of ICBMs, would achieve strategic superiority. Pentagon war games in 1974 and 1975 consistently showed NATO air forces being overwhelmed by MiG-25 regiments in the first hours of a European conflict. The key players in this technological Cold War occupied offices on opposite sides of the globe. At the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology in Langley, Virginia, Albert Bud Whelan ran a division obsessed with Soviet aviation. His analysts pored over satellite photographs, defector testimonies, and intercepted communications, trying to build a picture of the Foxbat's true capabilities. At the Defense Intelligence Agency, Air Force Colonel George Keegan insisted the MiG-25 represented an existential threat, publicly warning that Soviet interceptors could sweep American bombers from the sky like flies. His testimony before Congress in 1975 helped secure funding for improved air defense systems and accelerated fighter development. In Moscow at the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau, chief designer Mikhail Iosifovich Gurevich, then in his 70s, presided over what Soviet propaganda called the triumph of socialist engineering. The MiG-25 program employed 15,000 engineers and technicians. 3 production facilities churned out interceptors and reconnaissance variants. By 1976, over 400 Foxbats were operational, deployed from the Arctic Circle to the Mongolian border. Soviet Air Defense Forces, the PVO, treated MiG-25 pilots as an elite within an elite. They wore distinctive black flight suits. They trained at special facilities where even other Soviet pilots weren't permitted. Security protocols for MiG-25 bases exceeded those for strategic bomber fields. Viktor Belenko had been selected for MiG-25 training in 1971. Born in 1947 in the Russian Far East, son of a tractor mechanic, he represented the ideal Soviet pilot. Working-class background, impeccable communist credentials, superb reflexes, and demonstrated loyalty. His instructors at Armavir Higher Military Aviation School noted his exceptional ability to handle high-performance aircraft. He graduated third in his class. By 1975, he was flying operational missions with the 513th Fighter Regiment based at Chugievka Air Base, 140 kilometers northeast of Vladivostok. His mission intercept American reconnaissance aircraft, SR-71 Blackbirds and RC-135 electronic intelligence gatherers, that probed Soviet airspace along the Pacific coast. The Americans, meanwhile, had assigned their own elite to the Foxbat problem. The Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio maintained a permanent team dedicated to Soviet aviation analysis. They had built full-scale mock-ups of the MiG-25 based on satellite imagery, trying to understand its aerodynamics. They tested captured Soviet radar components to estimate the Foxbat's sensor capabilities. They interviewed every defector who'd served near MiG-25 bases, but they'd never gotten close to the aircraft itself. The Soviets guarded the Foxbat with paranoid intensity. When one crashed in Egypt in 1971, Soviet recovery teams arrived within hours, removing every piece of wreckage before Egyptian or Israeli intelligence could examine it. What both sides believed in September 1976 was that the MiG-25 was untouchable, invulnerable, a symbol of Soviet technological prowess. What was at stake was not just military balance, but the perception of that balance, the belief among NATO allies that American air power could still project force, and the belief among Soviet leaders that their interceptors made their homeland impregnable. The psychological dimension mattered as much as the technical. 1. No one in Washington or Moscow suspected that the truth would arrive on a Monday afternoon, piloted by a disillusioned lieutenant who'd decided that life in a Siberian military town wasn't worth the prestige of flying the Soviet Union's most advanced fighter. What was really happening inside the MiG-25 program bore little resemblance to the technological marvel NATO intelligence had constructed in their analyses. The reality began with metal. Western analysts assumed titanium. The Soviets used steel. Specifically, they used nickel-steel alloy, heavy and crude but capable of withstanding the thermal stress of high-speed flight. The entire airframe weighed 64,200 pounds empty, nearly twice the weight of an F-15. The steel construction meant the MiG-25 flew less like an interceptor and more like a ballistic object, trading maneuverability for straight-line speed. The engines told a similar story. The Tumansky R-15B300 turbojets, 2 of them, each producing 24,700 pounds of thrust with afterburner, were fundamentally 1950s technology scaled up to absurd proportions. They consumed fuel at a rate of 28,000 pounds per hour at full military power. Combat radius was 186 miles, meaning the MiG-25 could barely patrol its own airspace before requiring aerial refueling. The engines used primitive metallurgy. Turbine blades were manufactured from steel instead of the nickel-based superalloys American engines employed. Service life was 150 hours before mandatory overhaul. American engines routinely operated for 1,000 hours or more. The avionics revealed the deepest disparity. The Smerch A radar weighed 770 pounds and used vacuum tube technology throughout. Vacuum tubes, not transistors. The Western electronics industry had abandoned vacuum tubes for most applications by 1965, but Soviet engineers clung to them for reasons both practical and ideological. Vacuum tubes were resistant to electromagnetic pulse from nuclear detonations. They were simple to maintain. and the Soviet electronics industry couldn't manufacture transistors with sufficient reliability. The radar consumed so much electrical power that it could only operate for 15 minutes before overheating. Pilots were instructed to turn it on only when actively intercepting a target. The flight control system was entirely mechanical, cables and hydraulic actuators, no fly-by-wire computers. The autopilot could hold altitude and heading, but couldn't perform complex maneuvers. In high-speed flight, the aircraft's control surfaces became so stiff that pilots needed both hands and considerable physical strength to execute even gentle turns. At speeds above Mach 2.5, the aircraft became essentially unflyable by human input. You could point it in a direction and light the afterburners, but any attempt at maneuvering risked structural failure. The airframe's G-limit was a mere 4.5, about half that of contemporary Western fighters. Declassified documents from the period tell the story through numbers and bureaucratic language. A 1977 CIA Technical Intelligence Report, classified Top Secret Umbra and only released in 1997, noted, analysis of the MiG-25 aircraft delivered to Hakodate indicates Soviet manufacturing techniques lag American standards by 8-12 years in airframe construction, 10 to 15 years in avionics, and 5 to 8 years in power plant technology. A Defense Intelligence Agency assessment from October 1976, partially declassified in 2001, was more blunt. The MiG-25 represents a brute force engineering solution to the high-speed interception problem. It achieves speed through massive engine thrust and accepts consequent penalties in range, maneuverability, and systems reliability. The chess game between CIA and KGB had been based on mutual deception, but of different kinds. The KGB knew Western intelligence overestimated the Foxbat's capabilities and did nothing to correct the misconception. Soviet disinformation campaigns actively encouraged inflated assessments. At the 1973 Paris Air Show, Soviet officials allowed Western journalists to photograph the MiG-25's cockpit, but only after removing the most primitive-looking components and replacing gauge faces with cleaner-looking forgeries. The aircraft displayed in Paris had been specially prepared, its steel skin polished to look like titanium, its radar antenna replaced with a convincing but non-functional mock-up made from aluminum. The CIA, meanwhile, had developed its assessment of the Foxbat through a combination of satellite reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and theoretical modeling. The modeling was the problem. American aerospace engineers, when asked to design an aircraft with the MiG-25's observed performance envelope, naturally used American materials and techniques in their calculations. They assumed titanium because American engineers would have used titanium. They assumed transistorized avionics because vacuum tubes couldn't possibly generate enough processing power. They assumed efficient engines because inefficient engines couldn't fit in the observed nacelles. Every assumption reflected Western engineering culture, creating a mirror image of American technology rather than an accurate picture of Soviet capabilities. The technical details of the MiG-25's actual construction revealed a design philosophy fundamentally alien to Western thinking. Soviet engineers accepted weight penalties that would have horrified their American counterparts. The nose redome was made from fiberglass, simple, heavy, but radar transparent. The cockpit instrumentation looked like it belonged in a 1950s airliner. Analog gauges, mechanical indicators, a gun sight that used actual optics rather than electronic displays. The ejection seat was a massive contraption that weighed 250 pounds, compared to 140 pounds for American ejection seats. Even the fuel was different. The MiG-25 used T6 jet fuel, a kerosene-based mixture with a lower flash point than Western JP-4, chosen because it was cheaper, to produce and more available across the Soviet Union's vast territory. Behind the scenes in 1976, both intelligence services maintained massive analytical efforts focused on each other's aviation programs. At the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, analyst Peter Mackinson had spent 4 years studying every available photograph of MiG-25 deployment patterns, trying to determine how many were operational and where they were based. His work product, a classified weekly summary called the Soviet Aviation Digest, went to the President's Daily Brief team. At KGB headquarters in Moscow's Lubyanka building, the 5th Directorate maintained files on every American intelligence officer known to work on Soviet aviation issues, tracking their movements and contacts. The irony was that both sides possessed information that should have revealed the truth. The CIA had recruited a source, never publicly identified, codenamed Trigon, inside Soviet military logistics who reported in 1974 that MiG-25 squadrons required extraordinary maintenance support and suffered chronic parts shortages. The report was filed and largely ignored. It didn't fit the prevailing assessment. Soviet intelligence had intercepted American air attaché communications, expressing surprise at how crude MiG-25 manufacturing appeared in telephoto images. But KGB analysts dismissed this as deception, believing the Americans wouldn't genuinely express doubt over unsecure channels. The human element underlying this technological competition manifested in thousands of individual decisions. Engineers at Mikoyan Gurevich made vacuum tubes work because transistor production targets were never met. CIA analysts built worst-case scenarios because underestimating Soviet capabilities meant risking American lives. Soviet factory workers welded steel airframes because the titanium mills in Verkhnaya Salda couldn't produce enough material. Pentagon budget officers requested funding for advanced fighters because showing weakness invited congressional cuts. Each decision, rational in isolation, contributed to a collective misunderstanding that shaped defense policy for a decade. The MiG-25's true mission requirements, revealed in declassified Soviet Air Force planning documents from the 1960s, showed it was designed to intercept one specific threat: American B-70 Valkyrie bombers capable of Mach 3 cruise at extreme altitude. The Soviets knew from intelligence sources that the B-70 program was proceeding and built the MiG-25 to counter it. But the B-70 was canceled in 1961 after only 2 prototypes were built. The MiG-25, already in development, continued to production anyway. It was an interceptor built to fight an enemy that no longer existed, wielding capabilities optimized for a threat that never materialized. Soviet military bureaucracy couldn't cancel such a prestigious program, so they built hundreds of aircraft designed for a mission that made no strategic sense by 1970. The documents Viktor Belenko carried with him, stuffed inside his flight suit, included technical manuals, maintenance schedules, and operational procedures. American intelligence had never seen these materials. When CIA translators began working through them in October 1976, they found procedures that seemed bizarre. Pilots were instructed to limit radar use to conserve electrical power. Afterburner operation was restricted to emergency situations due to engine wear. And the aircraft's maximum speed was actually limited by heat buildup in the steel airframe, not by engine performance. The truth was encoded in maintenance schedules showing 80 hours of ground maintenance for every hour of flight time, compared to 20 hours for American fighters. September 6, 1976 had begun as a routine training mission. Viktor Belenko received his flight briefing at 11 o'clock a.m. at Chuguyevka Air Base. His aircraft, MiG-25P serial number 37, red stars painted on the wings, sat on the hardstand with ground crew performing pre-flight inspections. The mission called for practice intercepts against a simulated target flying along the Sea of Japan coast. Flight time, 40 minutes. Return to base, 1 o'clock p.m. Weather was acceptable. Cloud layer at 3,000 meters, visibility 10 kilometers, winds from the northeast at 15 knots. Belenko had made his decision 3 weeks earlier. The precise moment came on August 15th, sitting in the officers' club at Chuguyevka, watching a propaganda film about Soviet achievements in space technology. Something broke inside him, not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet recognition that he couldn't continue. The privileges of being a MiG-25 pilot, the better food, the private apartment, the respect, no longer compensated for the spiritual emptiness of his existence. He was 29 years old. His marriage had collapsed. His daughter lived with her mother in a different city. He drank too much. And he flew a machine that represented everything the Soviet Union claimed to be but wasn't. Advanced, powerful, invincible. The planning required patience. He studied approach plates for Japanese airports, memorizing frequencies and runway orientations. He calculated fuel consumption rates, determining exactly how far he could fly on a standard training load. He practiced English phrases, repeating them silently. Request emergency landing, asylum, defection. He told no one. The KGB maintained informants in every squadron. Even a careless word could mean arrest. At 12:16 p.m. on September 6th, Belenko's MiG-25 lifted off from Chuguyevka, afterburners painting white fire across the runway. Soviet air defense radar tracked him climbing to 7,000 meters, turning southwest toward his assigned patrol area. Ground control acknowledged his position. Everything appeared normal. But instead of maintaining his assigned heading, Belenko banked west, descending to 500 meters, below Soviet radar coverage, and pushed the throttles forward. The MiG-25 accelerated toward Japan at 950 kilometers per hour, engine screaming, fuel gauge unwinding. Soviet radar lost contact at 12:24 p.m. The controller radioed, "Aircraft 37, you are off course, confirm heading." Silence again. "Aircraft 37, acknowledge." Nothing. At 12:27 p.m., the alert went up through PVO channels. A MiG-25 had deviated from assigned course and was not responding. Emergency procedures kicked in. Other interceptors scrambled from nearby bases, orders issued to locate and intercept the missing aircraft. Coastal radar stations alerted to maximum vigilance. But Belenko was already 60 kilometers inside Japanese airspace, and Soviet fighters couldn't legally cross the border. What went wrong, from the Soviet perspective, was that their security protocols couldn't prevent a pilot from simply pointing his aircraft in a different direction and flying away. MiG-25s had no remote destruct mechanism, no way to disable the aircraft from the ground. The fuel load was sufficient for combat operations, which meant sufficient for defection. and the aircraft's speed meant that from the moment Belenko turned toward Japan, the Soviets had perhaps 10 minutes to react before he crossed the border. 10 minutes wasn't enough time to launch interceptors, identify the correct target, and execute an aerial engagement. The human decision that changed everything happened at 12:41 p.m. when Belenko spotted the Hakodate runway through broken clouds and realized he'd misjudged his fuel consumption. The gauge showed 800 kilograms remaining, enough for landing, but only barely. If he missed the approach, if the Japanese refused landing clearance, he couldn't divert to another airport. It would be Hakodate or nothing. He had committed to a course of action that removed all alternatives. The technical term was bingo fuel, the minimum required for landing at the nearest suitable airport. Belenko was beyond bingo. He was committed. His voice on the radio transmission, recorded by Japanese air traffic control and later analyzed by CIA linguists, showed controlled urgency. Hakodate Tower, this is Soviet aircraft requesting emergency landing permission. Requesting emergency landing, I have no fuel. The Japanese controller, speaking English with a heavy accent, responded, Soviet aircraft, you are cleared to land runway 12, wind 050 at 10 knots, QNH 1013. Belenko acknowledged, though he barely understood. He knew cleared to land. That was sufficient. The landing itself represented brilliant improvisation under extreme stress. MiG-25 pilots trained for long concrete runways at military bases, not the relatively short civilian strip at Hakodate. Belenko came in fast, touching down 400 meters past the threshold, the aircraft's weight causing it to sink hard onto the landing gear. He deployed the drag chute immediately, standard procedure. But the runway was shorter than he'd anticipated. The nose of the MiG-25 crossed the white end of runway markings with only 100 meters to spare. He stood on the brakes, hydraulics screaming, tires smoking. When the aircraft finally stopped, his flight suit was soaked with sweat. Real-time consequences unfolded across multiple time zones. At Chuguievka, the base commander was already on the phone with PVO headquarters in Moscow, explaining how a MiG-25 had been lost. At Japanese Self-Defense Force headquarters in Tokyo, officers stared at reports of a Soviet military aircraft landing at a civilian airport without authorization. At the Soviet embassy in Tokyo, the ambassador received a flash message from Moscow. Locate the aircraft immediately, demand its return, and prevent Japanese or American examination under any circumstances. At the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, a CIA station officer was placing a secure call to Langley, reporting information that would be on the president's desk within 3 hours. The technical failure was not mechanical, but conceptual. Soviet security procedures assumed loyalty could be maintained through surveillance, privilege, and ideological indoctrination. They didn't account for existential despair, for a pilot who valued the abstract concept of freedom over concrete material comfort. The KGB had files on Belenko showing him as a model officer. No disciplinary issues, no suspicious contacts, no evidence of ideological wavering. They'd missed the internal erosion, the slow accumulation of doubt that required no external contacts and left no evidence in the paper trail. In Hakodate, Belenko climbed down from the cockpit and waited. Japanese police approached cautiously, unsure whether this represented a military incursion or something else entirely. Belenko raised his hands, repeated the word asylum several times, and pointed at the American flag patch that he'd sewn inside his flight suit. It was a small American flag, purchased from a black marketeer in Vladivostok 3 years earlier, kept hidden through countless security inspections. He'd carried it on every flight, a private talisman, waiting for the moment when it would mean something. The MiG-25 sat on the tarmac, systems cooling, hydraulic fluid dripping from landing gear actuators. Inside, the radar was still warm, the vacuum tubes gradually losing power. Soviet manufacturing stamps were visible on every component, dates, facility codes, quality control numbers. The seat cushion carried the imprint of Viktor Belenko's flight suit. The navigation system contained the coordinates of every Soviet airbase within 500 kilometers. And in the cockpit, taped to the instrument panel, was a small photograph of Belenko's daughter. He'd left it there intentionally, knowing it would be found, a message to whoever examined the aircraft. This was personal, not political. This was about a life, not an ideology. The revelation of what the MiG-25 actually contained didn't come all at once. It emerged gradually through 6 weeks of painstaking disassembly in a hangar at Hyakuri Air Base, 100 kilometers northeast of Tokyo. The Japanese government, under intense Soviet pressure to return the aircraft immediately, negotiated a compromise. American and Japanese engineers could examine the MiG-25, but they had to work quickly, and the aircraft would eventually be returned to the Soviet Union. The Soviets wanted it back within 48 hours. The negotiations stretched to 67 days. The examination began on September 8, 1976. A team of 30 American aerospace engineers from the Foreign Technology Division arrived in Japan on military transport aircraft, bringing specialized tools, cameras, and analysis equipment. They were led by Colonel George Matson, a veteran of previous Soviet aircraft examinations who'd analyzed captured MiG-21s in Vietnam. Matson understood the political sensitivity. Every day's delay increased Soviet anger and Japanese discomfort, but rushing the examination would miss critical intelligence. He established 12-hour work shifts and demanded photographic documentation of every component. The first revelation came on September 9th when engineers removed the radar system's outer casing and discovered vacuum tubes. Captain Daniel Preston, an avionics specialist from Wright-Patterson, stared at the chassis for several seconds before calling Matson over. "Sir, you need to see this." Matson looked at the tubes, the primitive wiring, the hand-soldered connections. "Jesus Christ," he said quietly. "This is 1960s technology." Preston nodded. "Late 1950s, actually. The tube types date to 1958 to 1962. This isn't advanced. This is obsolete." The truth about the airframe emerged as engineers began removing panels and examining structural elements. They found steel, not titanium, steel everywhere. The welds were crude, visible with the naked eye. The fasteners were standard industrial hardware, not aerospace-grade precision components. An engineer named Robert Harrison, who'd worked on the F-15 program, ran his hand along a fuselage joint and felt the rough texture of painted steel. "They built this like a truck," he told a colleague. "Overbuilt everything because they couldn't make it light." Documents Belenko had brought provided context that made the technical findings comprehensible. The maintenance manuals, translated by Japanese-American linguists, revealed extraordinary service requirements. The engines required complete disassembly every 150 hours. The radar needed recalibration before each mission. The flight control hydraulics leaked constantly. Ground crew were instructed to top off fluid levels before every flight. One manual section, titled Emergency Procedures for Vacuum Tube Failure, listed 47 different failure modes and corresponding pilot actions. The revelation that changed Western military planning came on September 24th, when engineers completed performance testing of the radar system. They powered it up in the hangar, pointing it at reflector panels positioned at various distances. The radar's maximum effective range against a bomber-sized target was 55 kilometers, not the 100-plus kilometers intelligence estimates had assumed. Against a fighter-sized target, the range dropped to 35 kilometers, and the look-down capability, the ability to track low-flying aircraft against ground clutter, was essentially non-existent. The radar could see targets flying above the horizon or at high altitude, but anything below 1,000 meters merged with ground return and disappeared from the display. Colonel Keegan at the Defense Intelligence Agency, who had testified before Congress about the Foxbat threat, received the preliminary findings on September 28th in a classified brief. His response was documented in a declassified memo. "If this analysis is correct, and I have no reason to doubt it, then we have fundamentally misunderstood Soviet design philosophy and capabilities for the past decade. Recommend immediate reassessment of all Soviet aviation programs based on revised analytical framework." Viktor Belenko's own testimony, provided during extensive CIA debriefings in October and November 1976, filled in the operational picture. He described the constant mechanical problems, the limited training hours due to parts shortages, the pilot's frustration with an aircraft that looked fearsome but handled like a truck with wings. He explained that MiG-25 pilots were forbidden from performing aerobatic maneuvers because the airframe couldn't tolerate the stress. He revealed that actual operational missions were limited to straight-line intercepts at high altitude, with ground control providing all targeting information because the radar was unreliable. The career consequences rippled through both intelligence establishments. At the CIA, several senior analysts who had championed the advanced Foxbat assessment quietly moved to different positions. No one was fired. Intelligence work involves uncertainty, and overestimating enemy capabilities is professionally safer than underestimating them. But the embarrassment was real. A classified post-mortem report, partially declassified in 2003, concluded that analytical mirror imaging and insufficient attention to Soviet manufacturing constraints led to systematic overestimation of MiG-25 capabilities. In Moscow, the consequences were harsher. The base commander at Chugyevka was relieved of duty within 48 hours of Belenko's defection and demoted. The head of security for the 513th Fighter Regiment was arrested by the KGB, interrogated for 2 weeks, and sentenced to 15 years in a labor camp. The regiment's political officer was expelled from the Communist Party. Soviet news media made no mention of the incident. Censors blocked all foreign news reports about the defection. But within Soviet Air Force circles, everyone knew. A MiG-25 pilot had flown to Japan, and the Americans were examining the aircraft piece by piece. Belenko himself received political asylum in the United States on October 15, 1976. The CIA paid him $100,000, though agency accountants struggled with exactly how to classify the payment. Was it payment for the aircraft, for his debriefings, for his technical knowledge? Eventually, they settled on defector support payment and filed it under covert action accounts. Belenko settled in the United States, changed his name, and began a new life. He would later write a memoir published in 1980 describing his disillusionment with Soviet life and his decision to defect. The memoir became a minor bestseller, though it focused more on personal narrative than technical details. The documents declassified over subsequent decades tell the story's hidden chapters. A KGB report from October 1976, released by Russian archives in 2002, shows Soviet intelligence concluded that Belenko had been planning his defection for at least 6 months and had possibly made contact with American intelligence before September 6th. No evidence supported this conclusion. The KGB needed to believe the defection was influenced by external factors, not internal Soviet failures. A CIA damage assessment from December 1976, declassified in 1999, noted that the MiG-25 examination provided more valuable intelligence than any single operation targeting Soviet aviation in the past 15 years. The most revealing document emerged in 2008 when a cache of Soviet Ministry of Defense records was sold to a private archive. An internal memo from December 1976 proposing that all MiG-25 production be halted and the aircraft replaced with an updated design incorporating modern avionics and lighter materials. The proposal was rejected. Too much prestige was invested in the Foxbat. Admitting it was obsolete would validate Western analysis. Instead, the Soviets continued producing MiG-25s until 1984, manufacturing over 100 aircraft that were outdated before they left the factory. Belenko was vindicated by history, though at enormous personal cost. He never saw his daughter again. Soviet authorities told her that her father had been killed in a training accident, a lie maintained for 15 years. When the truth finally emerged after the Soviet Union's collapse, she was an adult with her own family, and the man who sent her birthday cards from America was a stranger. He attended his mother's funeral in 1993, returning to Russia for the first time in 17 years. Former colleagues avoided him. He spent 2 days in his hometown, then flew back to the United States. He never returned. The impact of the Foxbat defection reshaped Cold War strategy in ways both immediate and subtle. Within 6 months, the U.S. Air Force revised its threat assessments for Soviet air defense, downgrading the MiG-25 from critical threat to significant but limited threat. This reverberated through defense budgets. Programs designed specifically to counter the Foxbat, advanced jamming systems, extreme altitude penetration tactics, specialized training for B-52 crews, were scaled back or canceled. The funds were redirected toward different priorities: crews, missiles, stealth technology, and precision-guided weapons. The F-15 Eagle program ironically benefited from the revelation that its primary opponent was less capable than believed. The F-15 had been designed to fight the Foxbat on equal terms, to match its speed, exceed its altitude, and outmaneuver it. When the MiG-25's limitations became clear, F-15 advocates could argue that American technology had achieved superiority. The F-15 entered operational service in 1976 with enhanced confidence in its capabilities. Over the subsequent 50 years, F-15s would compile an air combat record of 104 kills to 0 losses, dominating every conflict they entered. The technology that emerged from examining the MiG-25 was less about copying Soviet designs than understanding Soviet manufacturing and operational constraints. American engineers recognized that vacuum tube electronics, while primitive, had advantages in nuclear warfare environments. This led to hardened electronics research, incorporating electromagnetic pulse resistance into strategic systems. The Soviets' brute force approach to achieving speed, massive engines, heavy airframes, accepted inefficiency, influenced American design thinking about specialized mission aircraft. If you needed an aircraft to do one thing supremely well, you could sacrifice everything else. This philosophy manifested in projects like the A-10 Thunderbolt ground attack aircraft, designed around a single gun and armored against ground fire at the expense of speed and maneuverability. Soviet aviation evolved in response to the defection, though the changes came slowly. The MiG-31, entering service in 1981, represented an attempt to build what the MiG-25 should have been: transistorized avionics, improved radar, genuine look-down, shoot-down capability, and better range. But Soviet industry still couldn't match Western standards in miniaturization and reliability. The MiG-31 was an improvement, but it arrived a decade late and still used design philosophies rooted in the 1960s. The fundamental gap, Soviet inability to manufacture high-reliability electronics at scale, persisted until the Soviet Union's collapse. The intelligence methodology changed more profoundly. The CIA established new analytical protocols specifically to avoid mirror imaging errors. When assessing foreign technology, analysts were required to explicitly document their assumptions about manufacturing capabilities, materials science, and industrial-based constraints. A new position was created: technology assessment skeptic, an analyst whose job was to challenge optimistic assessments and propose alternative explanations based on observed behavior rather than theoretical capabilities. The first person appointed to this role was a former aerospace engineer who'd participated in the MiG-25 examination. The human costs extended beyond Viktor Belenko and his family. In the months following the defection, the KGB conducted a sweeping investigation of Soviet Air Force personnel with access to advanced aircraft. Over 200 officers were interrogated. 47 were dismissed from service. 12 were arrested on various charges, though only 3 faced trial. The others were quietly reassigned to remote posts or forced into early retirement. The 513th Fighter Regiment at Chuguievka was disbanded entirely. Its pilots scattered across other units, their aircraft redistributed. The base itself was downgraded to a storage facility. The policy that emerged from the defection was codified in a classified National Security Decision Memorandum issued in February 1977. The document, declassified in 2012, established new procedures for exploiting Soviet defectors with technical knowledge. Payment structures were standardized. $100,000 became the baseline for military pilots, with bonuses for accompanying aircraft or documentation. Debriefing protocols were extended to include detailed technical questioning by specialists from national laboratories and defense contractors. And a new interagency committee was created to ensure that intelligence from defectors was systematically integrated into military planning, preventing the kind of analytical silos that had allowed the Foxbat myth to persist. The Soviet response included their own policy evolution. MiG-25 pilots were subjected to enhanced psychological screening and continuous monitoring. Flight procedures were modified to make defection more difficult. Fuel loads were restricted on routine training missions. Paired flights became mandatory, and radar tracking of all MiG-25 flights was required with immediate alert protocols for any deviation. These measures made defection harder, but not impossible. In 1983, another Soviet pilot, this time flying a MiG-23, defected to West Germany, though the intelligence value was lower since the MiG-23 was already well understood by NATO. Who lived? Viktor Belenko survived and prospered, eventually working as a consultant for aerospace companies and DoD contractors. He remarried, raised a family, and lived quietly in a Midwestern state whose exact location was never publicly disclosed. The CIA protected his identity. Public photographs show him only from behind or with face obscured. He spoke at closed conferences for military audiences, sharing operational insights about Soviet aviation culture. He outlived the Soviet Union by decades, watching the empire that had built the MiG-25 collapse in 1991. Who died? The KGB security officer from Chuguievka, sentenced to 15 years of hard labor, died in a Siberian camp in 1981, officially from pneumonia, more likely from the accumulated effects of malnutrition and inadequate medical care. 2 of the engineers who designed the MiG-25's radar system died during the investigation period, one from a heart attack at age 52, another from suicide, though the circumstances were never fully explained. Their deaths may have been coincidental, or they may have been Soviet. Bureaucracy's way of assigning blame for the defection's intelligence consequences. Who disappeared? Several Soviet Air Force officers associated with the MiG-25 program vanished from public records after 1976. One colonel who'd been photographed with Belenko in 1974 simply ceased to exist in official documents. No retirement announcement, no obituary, no pension records. The Soviet system was adept at erasing people, and the embarrassment of the Foxbat defection required scapegoats. How many careers ended, how many lives were quietly destroyed in the investigation's aftermath, remains unknown. Soviet records from this period are fragmentary, and the survivors aren't talking. The connection to the modern day manifests in the intelligence community's institutional memory. The MiG-25 incident is taught at CIA training facilities as a case study in analytical failure, how preconceptions shape intelligence assessment, how confirmation bias reinforces false narratives, how mirror imaging leads analysts astray. New intelligence officers study the Foxbat files and learn that the enemy you imagine is often more dangerous than the enemy that actually exists, but the real enemy can still kill you. The lesson isn't to underestimate adversaries, it's to assess them accurately. Modern aviation reflects the Foxbat's legacy in unexpected ways. The design philosophy that produced the MiG-25, optimize for one mission parameter and accept all penalties, influenced the F-22 Raptor's development. The F-22 prioritized stealth and supercruise at the expense of ground attack capability and cost effectiveness, a trade-off that only makes sense if you accept specialized mission focus. Russian aviation, meanwhile, still bears traces of the Foxbat era, heavy airframes, powerful engines, and acceptance of maintenance intensity in exchange for raw performance. The Su-57, Russia's current fighter, weighs 42,000 pounds empty, 50% more than an F-35, and uses engines that require overhaul every 1,000 hours, still short of Western standards. The intelligence methodology born from the Foxbat examination shaped how America assessed Soviet, and later Russian and Chinese, technology for the next 5 decades. When Chinese stealth fighters appeared in 2011, American analysts didn't automatically assume they matched U.S. capabilities. They looked at manufacturing evidence, metallurgical analysis of available samples, and operational patterns. They asked, what can their industrial base actually produce, rather than what would we build if we had their requirements? The epistemological humility learned from the MiG-25 became embedded in intelligence culture. The $100,000 paid to Belenko represented perhaps the highest return on investment in intelligence history. For comparison, the F-15 development program cost $12 billion. The knowledge gained from examining one defected MiG-25 allowed billions in defense spending to be redirected toward more effective programs. It revealed that Soviet aviation manufacturing lagged Western capabilities by a decade, information that influenced every subsequent assessment of Soviet military power. It provided exact specifications for Soviet radar systems, enabling development of countermeasures. And it demonstrated that technological competition between superpowers was as much psychological as material, that the perception of capability could matter more than capability itself, until someone crashed through the illusion with an act of individual courage. The MiG-25 itself, after 67 days of examination, was returned to the Soviet Union in pieces. American engineers disassembled it completely, photographed every component, and crated the parts for shipment. The Soviets reassembled it and placed it in a museum, but it never flew again. The aircraft Viktor Belenko had flown to Japan became a monument to a specific moment in Cold War history, the moment when myths confronted reality, and reality won. Soviet visitors to the museum could see the aircraft, but not the photographs American engineers had taken, not the reports they'd written, not the knowledge they'd extracted. The MiG-25 became a symbol of two things simultaneously: Soviet technological achievement and Soviet technological failure. Which interpretation you chose depended on which side of the Cold War you occupied. The sealed file sits in a temperature-controlled vault at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. It's thicker than you'd expect, 2,847 pages, bound in 3 volumes, classified top secret special access required. The cover page reads, Technical and Operational Analysis, MiG-25P Aircraft, September to November 1976. Inside are photographs, blueprints, metallurgical analyses, performance test results, and debriefing transcripts. The photographs show vacuum tubes where transistors should be, steel where titanium should be, crude welds where precision manufacturing should be. On page 1204, there's a photograph of the MiG-25's instrument panel. The gauges are analog, the switches are mechanical, and taped to the glare shield is a small photograph of a little girl, maybe 6 years old, smiling at the camera. The CIA analyst who inventoried the cockpit contents noted in the margin, personal photograph, subject unidentified, retained as evidence of pilot's personal motivation. Handle with care. The little girl in the photograph is in her 50s now. She lives in Russia, works as a teacher, and has children of her own. She knows her father is alive somewhere in America. They exchange emails occasionally, awkward messages across a cultural and linguistic divide that 30 years couldn't bridge. She doesn't hate him for leaving. She doesn't understand him either. He chose freedom over family, ideology over love, and whether that choice was brave or selfish depends on questions that have no answers. The final irony is that the MiG-25, the aircraft that NATO feared, that drove billions in defense spending, that represented Soviet technological prowess, was obsolete before Viktor Belenko ever climbed into its cockpit. It was obsolete when it entered service in 1970. It was obsolete when it was designed in 1964. The Soviets knew it, but they built it anyway because bureaucratic momentum is stronger than rational analysis, because prestige matters more than performance, because sometimes you build weapons not to fight wars, but to fight perceptions of wars. And the Americans feared it because they saw themselves reflected in its lines, saw what they would build if they needed a Mach 3 interceptor, and assumed the Soviets would build the same thing. Two empires, locked in competition, each seeing the other through a mirror that distorted reality into nightmare. The MiG-25 revealed a truth more valuable than any specification, that your enemy is not your reflection. They have different capabilities, different constraints, different philosophies. They build things differently because they are different. And until someone flies their machine across a border and hands you the keys, you're fighting a war against your imagination, not against reality. In Hakodate, Japan, at the spot where Viktor Belenko landed 49 years ago, there's a small plaque in Japanese and English. It commemorates the incident without explaining it, noting that a significant aviation event occurred here on September 6, 1976. Tourists photographed the plaque without understanding its meaning. The runway is unchanged, though the terminal has been renovated 3 times. On clear days, you can see Russia across the water, gray shoreline 60 kilometers distant. That's how far Viktor Belenko flew to escape, 60 kilometers, 8 minutes at 950 kilometers per hour. The distance between one life and another, between illusion and truth, between the empire that built magnificent machines from primitive materials, and the pilot who decided that freedom meant more than flying them. The question that haunts the final page of the classified file, written in an analyst's neat handwriting, never officially answered. How many other MiG-25s are sitting on runways across the world, feared for capabilities they don't possess, driving policy decisions based on misconceptions, waiting for someone brave or desperate enough to reveal what they actually are? The file doesn't answer. It just asks. And the question remains sealed, classified, waiting.